Glad you're here, Ian. As folks enter, we're just asking you to introduce yourself via chat so we know who's here. We'll get started in about another minute. Hi, Liam. What do you do at Emmanuel? Be helpful for us to know what role folks have as we continue on with the session. Yep, all the fun. Yep, I started my career in residence life, so I know what it's like. I can only imagine how challenging it is right now for y'all. So let's go ahead and get started. So the purpose of this session is really to introduce folks to some of the changes in the Master's Preparation Program standards, as well as really focusing on how to integrate the use of CAS standards throughout the Master's Preparation Program. Have a couple of polls after we go show you the learning goals. So really just to be able to describe the revision to the Master's Prep programs and then identify some ways to integrate CAS. So I'm hoping some folks might have some additional ideas. So first one, we have a poll, but we only have looks like six folks in here. Who is teaching in a master's program, either full or part-time, besides Anne Marie? Anyone else teaching right now? And if you're not teaching in a program, tell us a little bit why you're interested in this session, why you decided to attend this one. Give folks a minute or two to type in the chat. Oh, great. Liam, I hope you share some of what you've learned in your capstone. Since you use the Master's Prep Standards and CAS. For other folks, anybody else want to share why they chose to attend? Okay, let's go with the next question. How familiar you are with CAS? Either type, you can just enter a 1. This is the first time I'm learning about CAS. 2, I've read about or attended a CAS session. I use CAS as a professional, use CAS as a resource, or just go ahead and type in however you use CAS. So Anne-Marie uses it in classrooms. Liam has attended presentations and used it as a professional. And then poll 3. For those of you who use CAS, so right now it just might be Anne-Marie. What do you use which CAS materials do you use and how might you use them? And Ian, I'm glad to hear that you're learning about CAS in your program right now. So for you, Ian, why don't you tell us how you've been learning about it? What have you been talking about? How you've been using the CAS standards in your courses, in your program? So info and standards functional areas and the interclass and internship class. Great, thanks, Anne-Marie. But Liam, even though you're not using it in a teaching program, how do you use CAS standards in your work? You mentioned that you do use it in your work. try to use CAS to structure assessments. Great. So let's give you a little bit of an overview of CAS. So this may not be new to you all, but CAS was founded in 1979. A consortium now, I think CAS is up to 42 member organizations. Each of those organizations have two representatives, or they can have up to two representatives. And so that's really the council. Those are the individuals or the primary folks who are involved in the development and revision of CAS standards. Interestingly, CAS is having their annual November meeting at this very moment. So I had to step out of that. I'm actually finishing up my term as representing ACPA on the CAS Council. I finish up at the end of December. And they just approved a new set of standards yesterday for Indigenous student programs, which I'm really excited about. And they approved a proposal for a cross-functional framework for first-generation students. So I'm really excited about that. So we're not necessarily going to talk about it right now, but the functional areas are for specific areas within higher ed, such as housing, residence life, career services, those types of things. And cross-functional frameworks are for issues that transcend multiple offices. And so we have 3 cross-functional frameworks right now for first-year experience, for advancing health and well-being, and then also for crisis intervention, like behavioral intervention teams. And now CAS just approved a proposal for first-generation students, which actually came out of the a center at NASPA. So I'm really excited about that. So they'll spend the next year working on that. And then, actually, I think we're now up to 48 sets of functional area standards, and then 3 cross-functional frameworks, and I mentioned we're starting a 4th. And so, really interestingly, the CAS master's level professional standard is one way we can talk about using the CAS and grad prep program. So really just using this to guide prep programs, but also to actually think about how do we integrate other CAS tools into the program. So we'll kind of go over all those a little bit. So let's start with the master's level professional standards. Interestingly, this was the reason that CAS was founded. So back in actually, I think it's 1978, their group of folks came together to talk about how do we actually essentially almost accredit master's preparation programs. Out of that conversation actually came CACREP, who oversees the accreditation for counseling programs, because at that point in time, most of the student affairs programs were in counseling programs. But the folks that came together to talk about CAS realized we should really have standards for professional practice for other fields as well. So they still developed a set of standards for master's prep program, even though CACREP focused on the accreditation piece of it. But it's a little bit different. It's a different structure. There are different sections and also different sets of guidelines. So it looks totally different than the other functional area standards. The other functional area standards have 12 different sections. The master's prep have these 9. The mission and objectives is pretty similar to the mission and program section for functional area standards. And the only other one that is kind of similar is, while there is a legal section in the functional area standards, as well as an equity section, and then an assessment section. But everything else is really about the policies on the curriculum for master's prep programs. So I just wanted to highlight some of the revisions that were made in 2019. The original, the previous set of master's prep standards were developed in 2012. And I was lucky to be involved in that in one of my first years as a CAS council member. But there's some changes that we included this year. And this is actually based on feedback from over 100 full-time and part-time faculty members, as well as a group of about 7 faculty experts. So we added in higher education to the name of student affairs because a lot of programs now are higher education focused. We removed the number of credit hours in years for a program. Because in the past, the credit hour programs were required to be 40 to 48 credits and take place over 2 years. But we really talked about this idea about how the programs have diversified over the last 6 years, because we actually started working on this in 2018, from the last set of standards. And there are a lot more programs that are different credits and they're different years. For example, my program at a New England college that I direct is a 1-year accelerated program, although students could do it in 2 years. It's 40 credits, but it can be done over 1 or 2 years. however they'd like to do that. But we removed that as well as the number of hours for supervised practice because we really thought that the program faculty should decide what that should be. There are some programs that are 32 credit hours, some are 36, some are 48. We really thought that we should leave that up to the faculty to decide what was most appropriate. We had a long conversation too about how students have changed, where these standards are really developed for programs that cater to traditional age master's students. So typically students who come right out of their undergraduate experience and move into a master's program. And so for new folks like that, 300 hours of supervised practice really makes sense because they don't have a lot of professional experience. But for folks who already have professional experience and perhaps many years of it, supervised practice may or may not make sense. And so we left that up to the program faculty to decide on their own. And in the curriculum section, in the past, there really was a focus on courses that should be taken. And we really had this interesting conversation with the faculty feedback through the survey was the idea that, well, some of this content can be woven into existing courses, could be threaded across courses, or there's for some content, for some topics, they should be a standalone course. But again, we decided that really should be up to the faculty to decide how they want to cover that. So what the developers of the revision team decided is that rather than focusing on courses, we're going to focus on outcomes and content areas. So really, at the end of a program, students should have these outcomes. They should have knowledge and skills in these areas. And so then really leaving it up to the faculty to decide how they go about achieving those outcomes. Much greater focus on equity. In the past set of standards, the language was really about advocating for equity. And actually in this version, there's really about action and providing some concrete expectations of what types of action that program directors and program faculty should be taking. We updated some language. So for example, the previous set of standards used distance learning. So we updated that to online, and there's some other things like that. And really focused on the increased involvement of students. So involving students in the development of the learning outcomes, involving students in some of the curricular conversations and decisions. So really involving students to be co-owners of their own learning. So that was another addition that we put in there. You can get a copy of the standards on the CAS website. You can either buy them individually or as part of the bigger blue book, but those are available in the store section of the current standards. Any questions about the current master's prep program standards before we move on to actually how do you integrate, take a bigger picture about integrating CAS standards into the preparation programs? Any questions? Oh yes, all that information is in the set of standards. Yep, that's correct. There isn't there's not necessarily an overview of the changes, but all this information is included in the current set of standards. So let's talk a little bit about integrating. And so this actually is part of a bigger project that CAS has initiated to develop a set of resources for graduate preparation faculty. And so we're actually, the publication team right now is working on a set of resources that include a document that actually outlines some of these suggestions, as well as a guide for using CAS in practicum, put together by a faculty member, Jay Garvey, and some students at the University of Vermont. And there's a few other resources that we're bundling together for faculty to provide to faculty as a resource. We're also working on developing a graduate resource packet, because one challenge I had as a faculty member is asking my students to buy the Blue Book for $85, which is now $99, just because we're going to cover it in a couple of different classes. And so what I've worked with our resource development team to do is actually create a set of resources that we can put together in a packet at a very low cost for students that can actually be put in there. We don't have that information out yet, but what we'll be doing is once those are both of those sets of resources are finalized, which I'm hoping by the end of this calendar year, so by the end of December, I'll send a message out to the CSP Talk listserv And so those will be available on the CAS website, but I'll give you a heads up and a direct link to those. And so hopefully we'll have those done pretty soon. So let's take a look at some of the options. And so what we did for this resource, we actually did a survey and asked folks to share their ideas about how they're integrating CAS throughout their programs. So here are a few ideas, and I'm hoping to hear from you all about some additional ideas. So if there's a conversation regarding professional standards, it could be individual association standards, perhaps even the ACPA and NASPA professional competencies, the CAS professional competencies. There could be an exercise to compare and contrast the CAS standards with those other professional standards. It's an interesting discussion to take a look at. Have students work through this idea about how are the CAS standards different than the professional competencies. And so there easily can be built either an individual activity, group discussion, a group project built around that. And I think Anne-Marie kind of already alluded to this, using the functional area standards to learn about that function. And so for folks, perhaps like Leon, maybe this is how he learned about housing and residence life. Take a look at the standards to find out what are the key elements within that functional area that should be taken care of. Possibly comparing and contrasting two different dated versions of functional area standard. We typically, right now, we do them about every 8 years. And so it'd be interesting to take a look at the previous version and the most current version to find out how are they different, and how does that analysis help us understand how the field has changed. There's a lot of great information in the contextual statements. So this is really kind of a 2 to 3 page overview of our functional area before the actual standards are listed. And those contextual statements provide like a brief history of the standards, as well as what some of the current literature is. And so actually one of the resources we're putting together as a separate resource is a compendium of all the contextual statements from the functional area standards. And so that might be great in an intro student affairs course, or maybe an organization administration course. So students can actually use those contextual statements to learn about the various functional areas. What we do in one of my classes, we don't have time to do a full CAS review, but what we have students do as an activity in one class in the assessment course is take a mission statement from their department or one they find on the web, and actually go through the standards review process for the mission section for that functional area. So it gives students a taste of what it's like to, what the standards are, what the self-assessment guide is in terms of worksheet for doing self-studies. It really is a nice introduction without being overwhelming to the CAS standards. And there are actually some campuses that do many CAS reviews. Actually, I think the University of Georgia actually, part of their assessment course is to do a CAS review for the campus office. So the benefit of that is students actually get real life experience doing CAS review. And the campus offices have the additional support to do that type of review. Another idea would be to actually have the students do a review of the master's program itself using the master's prep program standards. So that might be an interesting, even if it's just a conversation rather than a full review, to really get students' input in how well is that program adhering to those standards, and to what extent should the program be adhering to those standards. Like I mentioned in the past version, there are requirements for 300 hours of supervised practice. We couldn't do that in my program because it's a 1-year program. So it's an interesting conversation that we could have with students about why is that? Is it good that we don't meet the standards? Is it, what does that really say about the program? What does it say about the expectations for the field? Could be included in practicum and assistantship or intern experiences, where they have either students learn about that functional area if it's new to them, or actually kind of reflect on that throughout the course of the assistantship, practicum, or internship to really get a sense to what extent is that institution or that department working, to what extent does that work align with the functional area standards. Perhaps even have students take a look at the current cross-functional frameworks and do some type of Q sort or some type of other exercise to think about what are the other topics that CAS could create functional area frameworks around, and how would those be prioritized? What would be the most important? We've had a lot of conversations in CAS about creating one around retention and student success. But then the conversations are, what does student success mean? How broadly should we define it? And so it'd be interesting to hear from students, perhaps maybe later on in their program, what would be some issues that really CAS should really be addressing through cross-functional frameworks. A nice assessment tool that I use is student-created quizzes or tests. So you might even have students develop a quiz or even a game show. Maybe they come up with Jeopardy questions related to CAS standards, and there is actually a competition or some type of fun game that can be done around that. There are a lot of other learning domains and dimensions besides the CAS learning domains and dimensions. There's actually AAC&U essential learning outcomes. There are some other information such as the degree qualifications profile. NACE has a set of learning domains and dimensions. Might be an interesting exercise to actually have students compare and contrast those. I do this in my assessment class so they can see the similarities and the differences between different learning domains. You can also have them map those and really kind of do a grid or a matrix that would map those map the learning outcomes across multiple frameworks, just to see the similarities and the differences. The CAS learning domains and dimensions is also going to be helpful for directing learning outcomes. So there could be an exercise where students actually develop learning outcomes based in those learning domains and dimensions. Possibly read and discuss CAS white papers. So CAS have a ton of white papers. There are ones on, actually one is just being published right now, finishing up in the editing process on how to use CAS in socialization of master's prep students or new master students and new professionals to the field. There's a white paper on CAS and regional accreditation. There is a white paper on how to use CAS to develop cultures of assessment. There's one that's focused on using CAS for cultures of assessment in HBCUs, which was just published Monday or late last week. So a lot of great white papers. There are also some white papers we call functional area resource papers that outline how to use CAS standards in functional areas beyond just doing assessment. How to use them perhaps for program development, for some strategic planning. And so there's some great examples, some mini case studies in those functional area papers to learn a little bit more how you can use CAS standards beyond the typical assessment process. One of our former CAS interns and new professional actually created an infographic on using CAS in the job search process, which is really a fascinating thing. So that's going to be included in both the faculty resource packet as well as the graduate student resource packet. Might be interesting to have students interview a current CAS council member to talk about the standards revision process, because it's really interesting how CAS goes through that process, because it's very collaborative, very consensus oriented. So the benefit of that is when CAS creates a set of standards or approves a set of standards, they're really approved by an entire field because all of those council members have to agree and to approve those standards. And if there's some difference of opinion, we actually work through those and talk through those. So that might be an interesting conversation for folks to have. Particularly if they could also talk to the representative for whatever functional area they may be interested in going into career-wise, then they actually make some networking connections as well. Because typically the representatives on the CAS Council are leaders from those associations. So the general standards are what we call the boilerplate. These are standards that are the exact same through all functional area standards. So for example, we're annually reviewing a mission statement. Doesn't matter what the functional area is, career services, res life and housing, even assessment programs, the mission statement should be reviewed annually. But there are other and more specific functional standards, which would be something related to a specific mission for a functional area, which are going to be a little bit different. So it might be really interesting to take a look at the general standards and to understand for that specific section of general standards for a course. So if there's a course on multiculturalism, equity, or inclusion, what are the CAS general standards include in that area? Are there things missing? Are there things that could be added? What is in a law class, what are the standards around the law set of standards for CAS? There are a lot of institutions are actually using a portfolio process for understanding student learning in master's prep programs, and this could be built around the CAS standards. Either the CAS standards for the master's prep programs, looking at those learning outcome areas, or it could be related to different functional areas. It could also be used in a course. So those are the ideas that came up through the survey and some of the thoughts that I had. What other ideas do folks have? How else are you using them, or did this spur on some other ideas for using CAS across multiple courses? Any other ideas? Yep, it always seems faster to talk than it is to type. Any other ideas? Yeah, I haven't done the grad review of the programs yet, but it's one of the things I'd like to try sometime. You know, in terms of the comparison of standards, I also thought it might be interesting to invite a CAS representative from one of the functional areas that has a set of programs. You know, housing, residence, life has that. A few of the other functional areas, to have them really talk about how the two sets align. That'd be an interesting conversation. So, Amory, how do you use them? How do you go about teaching folks about the functional areas before they're practicing their internships? Are they reviewing the CAS standards for that functional area, or is it part of a bigger conversation in the course? Oh, I like that. So do a review, present. That's great. And I think it's really helpful to introduce students to the CAS functional area standards because they can be daunting without some introduction or kind of taking a look at before they actually get into the field and have to use them. And I think it's part of the reason why folks don't use them as often as we would like them to is because they can be daunting. But I think the self-assessment guides are a really useful tool for going through a self-review process, self-assessment process, because those are worksheets that actually go through step by step. So I think it really makes the process a little less intimidating. Any other comments or even questions before I wrap up by sharing a few resources for folks? So let me share a few resources that I think might be helpful. So our 10th edition of the CAS Professional Standards for Higher Education just came out. Oh. Actually, the new approach to the Master's Prep Program standards, Susan? Is that what you mean? No, we actually haven't thought through that yet. They just came out last year, but we haven't really thought through what the assessment could look like for those. But that's something we can certainly think about. So the 10th edition of the Blue Book came out last year, or actually back in May. The Faldo's book, which is called the Framework for Assessing Learning and Development Outcomes, which came out in 2006, which is really a compendium of resources to assess each of the different domains and dimensions in CAS learning domains and dimensions. But now we've actually tasked a couple of Patrick Biddix from University of Tennessee, who's a faculty member there, as well as Darby Roberts, who is the Director of Student Life Assessment at Texas A&M, to actually create a brand new document on how to actually go about assessing outcomes. So the book is really helpful because it focuses on process and using the CAS learning domains and dimensions as the framework for student learning, but rather giving folks an off-the-shelf catalog or compendium. This actually talks through the process. So I'm excited that this will be coming out, I think, early spring, if not later this fall. I'm really excited to include that in my assessment course as a great tool to help students learn how to do outcomes assessment. For folks doing self-studies, particularly in the functional area self-studies, we have a do-it-yourself guide, which is really a very detailed step-by-step process for doing a self-study. I've already talked about the cross-functional framework. CAS also has multifunctional review process, which is a guide for doing functional area self-studies for small offices or small institutions like mine, where one office may oversee multiple functional areas. So for example, our student activities area oversees student activities, student leadership, orientation, the student center, and I think one or two other ones. And there's just no way with one full-time staff member and one graduate student that they could ever do all of those self-studies. And so we've created a guide for actually doing that. As I mentioned, the grad resource pack and the faculty pack, and then the white papers we have coming out continually. So if you go to the CAS store, there's a listing of the various categories of resources on the left-hand side, but they'll also be working on the building up the resource center, the resource tab, and adding some of these free resources to that tab. And then we have Facebook groups, which actually might be great to get some of the students connected to. We have one for 2-year college professionals, one for 4-year. We share information through our Facebook page. Twitter, we have a great YouTube channel which has presentations. Now that we've pretty much moved virtual for all conferences, CAS is actually taking the recordings from some of our sessions at professional conferences and uploading those to YouTube. So there's actually a great, there's one that Dan Bureau, who's the current president, and Jen Wells, who is the editor, we did for an assessment conference this spring, outlining kind of just an overview of CAS standards. And that's on the YouTube station. And so that might be a great homework assignment to give the students, is actually give them that presentation and then have a conversation in class about that. So you kind of flip the classroom a little bit, give them the video to watch or you can show the video in class if you want. It's about 40 minutes, I think, long. So there's a lot of other great stuff there. We'll continue to add things. Actually, our goal is to actually add this session to the YouTube channel once this NASPA Regional 1 conference is done. And then a lot of great stuff through CAS.edu for folks who are campus labs users or Anthology Anthology program reviews are available through through that tool. And then we have the CAS Resource Center, which I mentioned we're continuing to develop. So that's really what I've got at this point. I'm going to open it up and see if there are any questions. Any questions or comments from folks? I can email you a copy of the PowerPoint. If you'd like me to email it to you, please send me your email address. I have Anne Marie's and Susan's already, so I'm happy to make this available afterwards. And if everybody else would like one, just let me pop your email address in the chat, and I'll do that. And as always, I'm happy to talk about CAS individually, go into classrooms. I typically do presentations either on CAS in general or specific things for different classrooms, so I'm happy to do that as well. Well, if there are not any other comments or questions, we'll end this session a bit early, give you a little bit of break before the 3 p.m. session time. I hope your conference has been helpful so far. If you're interested in learning about design thinking in student affairs, I'll be doing a session on that with a couple colleagues from 2 Canadian institutions at 3 p.m. So feel free to jump over to that session and learn about design thinking in student affairs. Thank you all for attending and enjoy the rest of the conference.